gallery director here at SMU. So before I introduce our visiting artists, I want to talk for a minute about the events that are happening at both of the galleries this semester. So BFA season is right around the corner. We have 6 BFA shows this semester, and we're going to have 2 that run, or all the BFA shows are going to run as a pair. So simultaneously, one in the Tahoe Gallery with one in the Garage Door Gallery. Our next exhibition and the first BFA show starts with Courtney Ross. Yes. And she is in the Garage Door Gallery, and then we have Lauren Murphy in the Tahoe Gallery. And their reception will happen on the same day. The reception and artist talk on November 3rd at 5 p.m. Followed by that, we have Julia Hart and Victor Herrera on November 10th at 5 p.m. And then our last ones are Nikki Sardelli in the Garage Door Gallery and Gabe Zivak in Tahoe Gallery. And their reception is going to be November 17th at 5 p.m. So make sure that you make it to all of those BFA shows because those are going to be a blast. We've got some really nice work to do over here. All right, so now that we're all up to date on the gallery schedule, I'm so excited to introduce Häsler Gómez. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. A little bit about Häsler. Originally from Guatemala City, Häsler holds a BFA in studio art and a BA in psychology from UNR. He's exhibited his work nationally, most recently at the Alberta Abbey in Portland, Oregon, and the Trestle Gallery in Brooklyn, NY. Just to name a few, there's a lot going on that list. As an undocumented queer man, his work predominantly investigates issues of political, personal, social desire, social complexities, and connections between language, history, immigration, gender, and oppression. We are so happy to have you here, Häsler. Thank you so much. Take it away. Join me in giving
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. So I'm going to pretty much keep this talk pretty casual. I don't think any of us really want to go into long discussions about theory and philosophy tonight. So I'm pretty much going to run you through a visual history of my work, just to give you a better understanding of how I arrived at the work that's currently showing downstairs. Some of the work that I'm going to show you, I'm going to kind of pretty much just show you the images and go through. If you have any questions, I would suggest just leaving them for the end and be happy to expand on those. So I'm going to get started. So kind of going over what Molly had mentioned, I'm originally from Guatemala City, from the capital of Guatemala. I was brought illegally to the United States at the age of 4. I'm currently a Daca recipient. Just to give a kind of background on DACA, just because most people don't fully understand what it is. It was an initiative that President Obama started, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. What it means is that it gives us protection from being immediately deported, and it allows us to apply for work permits so that we can work. It's not a permanent solution. We still need pretty aggressive immigration reform, because every 2 years we have to reapply. It comes with a $500 fee, so that they can take your fingerprints, and then you can get another work permit. And as you'll learn, there's been times where it's lapsed, and I haven't been able to work. I've had to figure out how to navigate my life, pretty much being an American because I've lived here my entire life, but not having the same liberties that many U.S. citizens do have. In addition, my work has luckily been shown nationally, and I actually just got notified that I'm going to be participating in Baseball Art Fair in Italy, so it's the first time my work's going to be shown internationally, so pretty excited about that. That's especially being someone who's undocumented, who can't travel. It feels really special that my work can go to places that I personally can't. So I pretty much work in series. I've worked in series from the beginning of my art practice. Whenever I'm developing a series, the body of work that goes into it gets housed within a conceptual framework and world. But in the grand scheme of it, themes and images throughout each series kind of get reworked into newer series. So I look at each series as its own individual entity, but I look at the lineage of my work as a whole. So the first series I want to talk about was my Delta series. It's the earliest body of work that I was working on. This is before I even knew I wanted to be an artist. I was studying to be a neurosurgeon, and I had taken an art class, and I had really fallen in love with the idea of sculpture and being able to make something that inhabited my space and commanded that presence, not just from me, but from other people. So I was making these pieces out of painter's plastic sheeting, and then I would make these wooden forms and I would encase them in it. When I was working on all this work, I was really looking at representational images. I was interested in what they could symbolize. In this case, what could a bed symbolize? It symbolized intimacy, a place of rest, a place where people are born, where people die, and how it could use that as a common ground for then the viewer to kind of project their own experiences onto this symbol. So throughout this series, I utilized these kind of representational images as that starting point. And for me, it was really formative in just understanding how I wanted to navigate my artistic language. But it also really allowed me to understand that materiality was really important to me. One of the biggest things in regards to my work is that I love working with different materials, learning how to manipulate them, how to get them to do things that they perhaps shouldn't do. And then for me, I'm really concerned about the surfaces of my work. If you look at the work downstairs, you see the surfaces range, and I almost am tempting you to touch them. In fact, people often touch my sculptures. Little detail shot. And within these works, I was really interested in domesticity. All of these, the wood is they're furring strips and wall studs, so the things that you would use to construct a home. But at the time, I didn't fully really understand what I was doing because I didn't even know I wanted to be an artist. I was taking art because it really allowed me to kind of not concentrate so much on my science classes and really gave me an avenue to really understand what I was experiencing. I had always loved art as a kid, but as in most cases, you're not really told to pursue that. You're told to pursue something more academic or realistic. So I was pushed towards being a doctor. But in 2014, my mom was picked up by immigration officers and then was later deported. And during that kind of unraveling of my entire life, even though I knew that could always be a possibility, being undocumented and being in a family that was undocumented, but nothing can prepare you for the unraveling of your family unit. And at that time, I really didn't have anything that I could turn to. And then I decided to take an art class and kind of join the cult of being an artist. From there, I found that if art could help me process those experiences and understand them and in many ways heal through them, perhaps art could also do that for other people. So after I moved into that work, I moved into this series called the Boyce series. There's not too many images, and I almost didn't even show this series because it was a blimp in my kind of in the lineage of my art practice. I really only did this series because, as you saw, the rest of my work looked pretty similar. It was all plastic, it was all wood. And we had gone to go see an exhibition by an artist named Nick Van Wart, and his work was very kind of all over the place. It was often manufactured by artisans and not him, so you couldn't really pinpoint what he actually made and what he didn't. And we were discussing it in class, and someone, to kind of paraphrase what they said that my work was expected. You could tell what it was going to look like. And me, being as stubborn as I am, decided to never use plastic sheeting and wood ever again, and switched to found objects, which I absolutely hate. So a big part of, I loved making the objects because they felt like they were coming from me, versus found objects were very removed from me. I couldn't really claim them as my own. And as I often do in a lot of my series, I give myself rules. So when I was working on these, I was not allowed to really manipulate the objects much more than altering the surfaces and like painting or sanding, and then doing combinations. So for like this piece, I was stealing pages out of library books, and then encasing them in these frames with entomology pens, the kind that you would use for insects. So I was really interested in this idea that these books that I was stealing these pages from were now irrevocably destroyed. Yet you would never know. The librarians didn't know. If someone picked up the book, they might not know until they come by that page that was gently teared out. I was interested in that as a metaphor for how often we grapple with things that people don't see from the outside, yet on the inside we're dealing with these, often destructive forces. If the last series taught me a lot about materiality and the importance of materiality to me, this series taught me a lot about reductivity. It taught me what was that as close as I could get to zero action, where I could still make work that could produce meaning and could also produce an emotive reaction. And then for this, the floating shelf actually came out of, it was the top of the drawer for this. One technique that I use very often in my practice is bleach. In this case, I bleached my clothes until they started disintegrating. I come from a very religious background, and part of that kind of always instilled in me this inability to forgive yourself. We're always asking for repentance. And at this time, coming to terms with my queerness, while still being pious and understanding how it is that you navigate these things, especially when you don't fit perhaps into these very rigid categorizations of what your identity should be as a queer person. This piece really was about that kind of self-destructive inability to just let go or forgive. So like the pants in this piece were black, and then I bleached them until they literally started falling apart at the touch. So after I went to that work, I was kind of over just doing found objects. I came out of the UNR program where we were very much materially oriented. We were very much a maker's program. So we were always asked to make things. So when I was working with these found objects, I really did not like that I wasn't making the actual things. But I felt like I needed to find a middle ground between my earliest work where I was making everything and then the last work where I was utilizing these found objects. Because although I hated found objects at first, after working with them, I did find that there was a beauty to the history that they had, even though often it was hidden from me, but knowing that they had been touched and used by someone. So for the Cure series, I started utilizing found objects and objects that I made myself. For this was actually my BFA Midway exhibition. One of the artists that I look towards a lot is the artist Joseph Boyce. If you don't know him, I would suggest looking him up. I would go like Wikipedia. He's a little dense to get into. So I think Wikipedia is the most you need to understand about him. But I was interested in the idea of artist languages and how it is that we develop these languages. So in essence, when I was making this work, I wanted to make his work. I wanted to say that the normal brown kid from Reno, Nevada could make the work of this demigod who people often hold on this pedestal. So if you see the cross symbol, which actually is my own symbol now, I stole it off one of his paintings. I photoshopped the text out of it, and now I've made it pink. Again, reiterating the queerness, but also reiterating this idea of what originality means. They don't really believe in it. I think everything's already been said. There's maybe new combinations. But in this series, I was interested not only in taking on his kind of visual vernacular as my own, but also connecting my artistic lineage to a larger lineage. I think it's really important that as makers we understand that artists came before us. And you might not know the entire history of what came before you, but it's important to understand that the work you get to make now is because someone took steps before you. Deschamps had to put that urinal on that pedestal so that now we can make the work, whether you like Deschamps or not. They made that avant-garde work so that now we have the liberty to make the work we do. So a lot of this work was into reference. So in this case, again, speaking about materiality, these are casts of my hands, and they're cast in paraffin wax. Paraffin wax, if you don't know, is often used in canning to store things and to be able to make sure that they don't rot. So in this case, I wanted to cast these hands, and then I chose carnations because they're often considered a poor man's rose. They're not really this beautiful flower, and I really identified with that. But I wanted to adorn them with something, so I hand-welded nails or thorns for them to wear. So they each wear these thorn rings, and then if you look closely in the hands, there's actual demarcations, little holes in them that reference stigmata. So again, I was referencing the kind of religious background that I came out of, and also this idea again of not being able to let go of something, of wanting to preserve something that is by its nature ephemeral, you can't preserve. So for this piece, my work predominantly is in sculpture, but I also work in drawing, occasionally, sometimes in painting and audio, but performance is also a big aspect of my work. For this piece, I would wash the foot every day and light it. So at the same time, it was this tender act of washing a foot in reference to Jesus and the disciples when he washed their feet, but I would also watch this beautiful object that I labored over slowly disintegrate within my hand. So for this piece, this was also another biblical reference where the Bible, to paraphrase it, is talking about how it's, if your eye is the thing that makes you sin, it's better to cut it out and to enter to heaven with only one eye than with two, or enter into hell with two. So for this, I was really interested in this idea of silence, not only within my own identity, but also within my culture being Latino, or especially within men, I find that we're not really taught to express ourselves. So this is a facsimile of my tongue. I couldn't cast my own tongue because my tongue doesn't stick out far enough. But luckily at the time I had received an undergraduate grant, so I could fund things like buying a prosthetic tongue. So it's a cast tongue in sealing wax, and then it's actually sealed, and the seal is made of the handmade nail that holds up the title card. And then it sits on this bowl of burnt journal pages. But like I said, performance is a big aspect of my work, but often my performances are never seen. I'm really interested in that kind of labor that is unseen, not just as a reference to kind of thinking of performance in its purest form when it's not in front of an audience, where I'm not thinking about the audience's reaction, but it is just about that actual pure act. But also performance as in those things that we don't think about. You don't think about who laid the concrete you walk on every day. You don't think about who built the buildings that you go to school in every day. That labor is invisible. But then the performative aspect of this piece is that me being me, I couldn't just burn the journal pages in my studio. One, because I was banned from doing fires, because I would do fires a lot. But it felt important for me for that act of me burning my journals to feel like a sacrifice. So what I did is I took this wooden box, which was an old piece, and I made a little like backpack. I filled it with all the journal pieces, and then I climbed a mountain and burned them in a reference to a sacrifice, as they would in biblical times, where you would climb the mount and you would offer your sacrifice. So those are things that the audience member is not really privy to, but for me it's important because I think it adds to that layer of authenticity. An artist I'm really interested in is Marina Bramovich. She's a performance artist. She talks about how in theater the knife is fake and the blood is ketchup, but in performance the knife is real and the blood is real. And I very much bring that approach to my work, where if I'm saying it's there, it's because it actually literally is there. Now, in the long run, would it affect your experience as a viewer? Perhaps not. But for me as an artist, it really does matter that it be authentic. So after that, I moved on to my what became my senior thesis work. After I made that work, I think I wasn't really prepared for the reaction of the viewer, but also I wasn't really prepared for what I had kind of unleashed into the world. That work, I was casting my body parts and in many ways mutilating those body parts. And I hadn't caught on to, oh, what did I just tell the world? So after that, I swore off object making. I said I was no longer a sculptor, and I said I was going to be a painter. So I made a series of paintings I will not be showing you. You can look on my Instagram. There might still be some pictures on there. But after I did that, I was working with the same plastic sheeting, and I really loved the material. I loved its simplicity. I loved what it could do, how it looked. So for my thesis, I pretty much returned back to the material. But at this time, I was no longer feeling like I needed the representational imagery that I needed before. Before, I was making art because no longer wanted to be a brain surgeon. I wanted to be an artist. So I felt that at this point I had explored all these different representational and figurative forms, and I found that I was really much more drawn to abstraction because it could work as this primer or this thing for each viewer to project upon. Versus when it's my hand, it's kind of hard to remove my personal experience from it and allow you as a viewer to enter the work yourself. So another thing I do in my work is I bring work from older series into new ones. So this piece that ended up being in my thesis was actually one of the first pieces I ever made in the Delta series. And oftentimes it's just the changing of a name or rearranging how it's shown. But I love to weave work through series because it recalls them to life in a lot of ways. But it also shows me that maybe I didn't understand what I was doing back then, but now I do understand it, and I can change the context and use it in a different way. This piece consisted of almost all the textbooks I bought when I was in college. I wrapped them in plaster bandages and then in plastic, and then they actually started rotting. So another big theme in my work is the idea of silence, whether it's personal silence or it's kind of a societal silencing. I'm interested not just in silence as how it works within a society within marginalized individuals, but I'm also interested in silence as a method of communicating. You know, what do our secrets tell about us? What do the lies we tell about what is really important to us? And then a lot of my work is built up of layers, but it's not just a conceptual layering of references. It is very much a physical layering. A lot of my works have writing embedded in them. So this is the actual writing that's embedded in this table sculpture. You would never see it. Again, it's these aspects of authenticity that are really important to me in my practice, regardless if the viewer is privy to it. To me, it is essential that they exist within the work. Another aspect of my work is I really turn towards destruction as a creative force. I think destruction is interesting not only in the context of masculinity being a destruction is kind of a masculine force. So this is a chair that I beat with a sledgehammer for 4 months until I sculpted it into this form, and then I went through the kind of process of cocooning it. Yeah, I destroy a lot of things, and then often when I'm destroying things, I record the audio that becomes the documentation of the performance, and then often the audio becomes its own piece. So oftentimes a piece will start as a sculpture, but then this also became an audio, but then it also became this kind of weird in-between photo that then became this photo. So I like looking at work not just as once it's done, it's done. I think installing in different places, photographing it, allowing extra layers and allowing it to enter into other mediums. The pandemic really taught me a lot about that. Because before I was very much a sculptor and I would only show objects. Kind of really hard to ship these very heavy concrete objects, especially when I started showing across the country. When it's in Reno, it's super easy. I can just drive it and install it myself. So funnily enough, 2020 was the year I showed the most. And it's also the year I showed the most across the country. So learning to work and make objects into photographs, into prints, was really essential, and I think it's something that we often don't talk about. You have to be versatile. You have your way of working, and that's important. What is important to you and your work matters, and you should not be willing to compromise that. But you should be able to be flexible in order to survive within the art ecosystem, because it's hard to be really stubborn about certain things. So that's just my 2 cents about that. So that brings us into the current series I'm working on, which is called In the Land of Milk and Honey. So the name of this title literally comes from the Bible. Again, the biblical references are pretty ingrained in me. My grandpa's a pastor. I grew up in the church as a preacher, so it's kind of hard to get it out of me, especially when our society is so influenced by Christianity. So the reference is it's what the promised land was called to the Israelites. It was called the land of milk and honey. But it's also what my parents always called the United States. That it was this place of milk and honey, of prosperity, that it was this paradise. When I named the series this, it was meant to be ironic. That this is not a land of milk and honey. The poem that actually goes along with this exhibition says that the milk rotted in our mouths and the honey turned to stone in our throats. So it's taking this idyllic image that's how we're told that the American dream is for everyone, anyone can achieve it, but turning it on its side and seeing what it's actually really like. So I started making this work after I graduated college. My DACA lapsed, and because it lapsed, I could not find legal work. So after being in school for all these years, working to get my degrees, I had worked hard to get out of, what my parents had to do. And then I found myself working on a construction site as an illegal laborer. So at one time I was at the top of privilege, being able to say that I had an art degree, that I was educated in a lot of esoteric things that most people don't know, don't have access to, or yet understand. But at the same time, I was shoveling cement and pouring concrete. So it put me into this flux where I could not avoid but make work about it, because I understood that I knew I had a way out. I knew at some point my DACA would be reinstated. I could go find another job where I wouldn't have to be out there baking in the sun, being used as an object for someone else's means. So for me, it felt important that I use my privilege to be able to make work that spoke about these experiences and honored these individuals who in reality don't have a way out of them. So this is the first iteration of it. There's been the one downstairs is the fourth one. So this is actually the last piece I made in school. It's called Unnamed Death Masks. They're made by casting the negatives of dust masks. When I was working in construction, they would give us these flimsy little masks that there really was no point in wearing them. You were still exposed to all the toxins. And much as you complained, they didn't really care. So I wanted to make these masks to honor these individuals while also understanding that in the grand scheme of things, they don't have an identity. They don't have a face. They don't have a name. So I wanted these to be markers of not only their suffering, but also of what their bodies went through. Some of these masks were left, just like a normal cast, while other ones I used clay to manipulate and distort them. Like you would see a lot of these people, their bodies would, after time, be distorted from the labor, from the chemicals that they're exposed to. This is an installation shot. So this exhibition was shown at the Holland Project Servo pool space. It was during their summer installation series. When I started making this work, I was really interested in this pink string that we kept using on the construction site. We used it not only to mark our lines of where our concrete height would be, but we also used pink so we wouldn't run into it, which I'm sure some of you have experienced downstairs. It's not always bright enough. But when I started thinking about it conceptually, this idea that this string marcated where a future point or a level would be, I thought it was really interesting, and I wanted to start using them to influence the architecture of the gallery space. To take this very minute thing and have it dominate the gallery space. So when you enter this gallery space, there's a piece, I'm not going to show you because I don't like that piece anymore. There was a piece of grass that as soon as you open the door, you stepped on it. So most people were really shocked that they enter a gallery and stepped on a sculpture. And then they enter and they see these walls. And these walls really end up functioning almost like a psychoanalytic mirror. Some people will refuse to go through them as if they were solid walls, versus some people will jump right through them. So for these, most people would navigate through them, but it was also, for me, I was interested in this idea of borders. They're very imaginary. They're not really real. In the same way that with these, there's a legal way to go through them, or there's an illegal way to go through them. And then this piece, this is called, I think this was named Elegy 1. So elegy, it sounds like the word eulogy, but elegy is a poem you write for someone who's deceased. And a lot of my work, writing, and language is really essential. I come from a background as being a poet, so I think of my work in a lot of ways like I build a poem. I think of the entire installation as the entire narrative poem, and each piece is a line within that poem. So for this one, these are handmade pavers that I cast. I stole 2 sets of these pavers from the construction site I was working on. I made molds and then I cast my own out of them. And then this bucket, if you see, has a little cross. Crosses come in my work all the time. This bucket already had the cross. I didn't even design it that way, just had it. And it was really hard for me to want to use the bucket because I was used to these found objects, these vintage objects that had a history, had a beauty and a design to them. But when I started switching to these very industrial materials, they didn't have that same essence or that same aura of originality to the objects. But in the process of working with it, I took this thing that had no meaning and nothing I didn't care about, and I made it into something that I did. So on the inside, when you would first look, you'd see kind of blurry, and then you'd see this kind of grotesque, mangled thing within that little hole. This piece was inspired when I saw the images of the bodies that were mutilated in Mexico, and I was just I was struck by how someone could do that to another person, and I wanted to make a memorial to them. A lot of my work is about making these memorials, these markers of these lives that in no other context would they ever receive importance or memorials or even get a mention. Another installation shot, so again, alluding to that idea of the wall, whether it's reconstructing where there could have been a wall or if it's projecting into the future where there will be a wall, I really wanted to create these architectural interventions, but I didn't want them to be these kind of brash, like actually making a wall. I wanted that subtle suggestion of a wall. Then the second iteration was in Land of Milk and Honey 2 in my father's house. So as I started working on this work, I started thinking a lot about wanting to kind of connect to my past, and then understanding that I really couldn't. In my culture, it's very much about the future. You know, my parents expect me to have more than they did, and then they would expect my children to have more than me. It's always this projection into the future, not into the past. Like I've told people before, like my great grandpa, the only thing I know about him is that his name was Felipe and that he died a couple weeks before I was born. I don't have access to that archive. My family doesn't keep things. And even when people suggest like, yes, I have like Mayan roots, that is not my culture. I am not Mayan. I have, you know, genetic ties to being Mayan, but me, myself, my culture is not Mayan. So I very much feel like this unrooted person that doesn't have that lineage. So for when I moved into the second kind of stage of the series, I wanted to make these artifacts that could be stand-ins for this kind of lineage. There's this quote by Edward Says that says, "Origins can't be found, they must be created." And when I read that, it really resonated with me that what do we often do when we don't know how something came about? We create these origin stories. Cultures for all of time have created these origin stories. So when I moved into the second phase, I wanted to create an origin story, not just for myself, but for people like me, that then that could be our lineage, and we could use that as kind of to project into the future. So this is an installation shot. And again, with this one, the wall was made right across. So I actually had people who refused to enter this gallery space. They felt that it was not for them, and often those were the most privileged people. They felt that it was not for them, and that was kind of the point. A lot of these interventions I use are everyday things that construction workers use. You use a brick to hold down your line, you draw your line. And in fact, when I would have like construction work and stuff look at my work, they recognize those cues. But often people who are very privileged and educated, who you would think would know, they don't. So it was a reversal of that privilege dynamic. So as I had mentioned, language is really essential to me. Not only the fact that English is my second language, but the fact that a language that is not inherently mine is how I navigate. You know, it's how I think. My inner narrative isn't English. And learning to navigate my identity within a language that is not wholeheartedly mine has kind of always made a rift. When I started making these works, I wanted to use language in a way that would actually communicate an experience. Oftentimes, I think language does not really land there. I can tell you I'm sad. That doesn't really communicate the emotion, the experience. That's often why I turn to poetry, because poetry is an abstraction of language, and often through metaphor, through simile, through these, these narrative techniques, can capture experience. But in this piece, I wanted to use the destruction, the breakdown of language to communicate an experience or a feeling. So these are made, I'm blindfolded by a sliver of the American flag, and then I hold a permanent marker stick in my mouth, and then I write. So this drawing is about 23 feet long. It's the longest one I've ever done. Actually, the only one that's ever been documented. As I've said, most of my performance work has never been seen. This is the only one that's ever been documented. I'm not going to show you any of the pictures of the documentation. Those are for me. But funny enough, when I was performing this piece, I didn't realize I was no longer on the paper until I ran into the wall. And then I kind of had to reset to do it. But again, for me, it was that breakdown of that language wanting to communicate that experience without that burden of language being this rigid thing that, although we use it to communicate every day, doesn't really capture experience. Again, surface being really important to me. And for this, there's actually a version of one of these in the show downstairs. It was just altered. So again, bringing work from different series and giving them new lives, kind of understanding them in a different way once I start making more work within the series and altering them to work as the narrative continues to develop. So these are concrete casts of paper, and the paper is Wall Street Journal articles that were discussing tragedy. One of them was about the volcano eruption in Guatemala. And I was really interested in not only how these tragedies were depicted and narrated, but I was also interested in wanting to eviscerate the way that they were narrated. So like when the volcano eruption happened in Guatemala, from the US side, it was being depicted as this tragedy, that this third world nation was just up in flames. And my mom being in Guatemala, I'd be like, "Are you guys okay?" And she's like, "Yeah, we're fine." So it's this idea of how these narratives are told and which ones are actually given like social currency. So for this, wherever there was an image, I placed tape over the image, and then when I cast it, there was that residue of where that image was eviscerated, and then all the text is now gone. So not only did I want to eviscerate the way that these narratives were told, I think all of us understand that the way history has been written is perhaps not the correct way or the truest way. I wanted to erase those ways that these tragedies were told, but also give space for them to be retold. So for this piece, I started wanting to work with styrofoam, not only because I thought it was interesting that it's a material that kind of is very stubborn. It doesn't go away, won't decompose. But I was also interested in the geometries of the styrofoam. One, because I feel like it captured the geometries I was already interested in, but it also really seemed to look familiar to Mesoamerican kind of geometries. So again, wanting to connect to this past that I didn't understand, but I didn't want it to be in a way where I researched it and came to understand what Mesoamerica was like, because that wouldn't connect it to my own identity. I can research all I want about it, but it won't actually embed itself into who I am as a person. So I wanted to create these artificial artifacts. So for this one, I was sealing them in liquid rubber as a way to kind of change up the surface. It didn't end up working. I don't really do that anymore because it was pretty toxic and it made my studio smell really bad. But this piece actually, inside of it, has the backpack I was wearing when I crossed the border. And it also has the teddy bear that was the first present I ever got when I came to the United States. I made this piece when I saw images of the two Guatemalan children who died in one of the camps when they were separated from their parents. Again, wanting to make this marker of that life that would never receive a monument. Wanting to create this thing that could honor these lives. And then again, crosses show up a lot in my work. So these are named unnamed monument 1 through 13. They're cast of 7-Eleven Big cups. I started making these pretty much just as a material study. I had left working the construction site, but I had really fallen in love with working with concrete and what it could do, the nuances in it, how it could be a soft material, but how it could also be very rough and hard. So I started casting these just as a material study, and then I started thinking about them in the context of a monument. Often we think about the bronze or whatever the actual metal that the monument is made of, but we don't think of the concrete plinth that it sits on. So I wanted to make monuments that were made of that actual labored material that holds them up. So I started casting these, and kind of serendipitously, my great grandma died, and she was the first person in my family who had ever died within my lifetime. So when she died, I wanted to mark that because, again, being in the States and not being able to travel, you feel that loss, but you can't really conceptualize it because they're never really around you and you have no ability to go and grave them and visit them. So it's like you hear a death, but it's secondhand because you can't really experience it. So I wanted to mark that. And then as I started casting more of them, I started marking metaphoric deaths. They didn't have to be a literal death. And the more I started thinking about them within the context of memorials, but also the idea that they were a cup, I started thinking about libation, which was this ancient practice of pouring out wine for the deceased, which now in many ways has been co-opted as pouring one out for the home. So this idea of this practice that could be ancient but also rooted in contemporary culture, but now I wanted to solidify. I didn't want it to be this thing that disappears. And then again, the sculpture then became an image. And then this image became the promotional for the next iteration of In the Land of Milk and Honey 3 If My Voice Could Speak. And again, the pieces from the first one then became this promotional image. So again, bringing works in and letting them have different lives just outside of being a sculpture and installation. So this is an installation shot. So this was shown in Third Room Project in Portland, Oregon. This was shown during the pandemic, so it was a little interesting navigating all of that because I make my exhibitions based on the space, so kind of having to map everything out without actually being in the space. So in this case, the string walls were never really meant to be that way. They became that way because I reacted to the space. So when I entered the space, I noticed that there were these two grooves in the floor where a wall used to be. So I wanted to honor that history of the space and suggest a reconstruction. In this case, the cement slabs, instead of them being on the wall, were now on the floor because they almost blended in perfectly with the floor. You could almost ignore them. You can almost not see them. This is a sand cast. Sand is very hard to cast. Don't try it at home. And these are made by casting them within a sandbag, and then each of them has an imprint of me doing an action. In this case, me playing dead. And then that was the last libation cup I cast when my last grandma died, and then I marked her name in the abstracted language. A lot of my work has poetry that goes along with it. The first iteration of The Land of Milk and Honey, it was an audio piece. I designed a phone bot that when you texted it, it would record your number, and then when the exhibition closed, the phone bot called you and played the audio of me reciting the poem. So it was this kind of ephemeral takeaway. Since then, I've moved into an actual literal takeaway. The same palette's downstairs right now with the poem that accompanies this exhibition. So this piece used to look like this. If you go downstairs, it's different. One of the aspects about working with kind of non-traditional materials is that sometimes they won't do what you want. So it was like this yesterday. It's no longer like that today. And it's learning about adapting. With the strings, Molly sending me an email that, people are running into it. How do we address those? You can navigate the gallery system and do work that's non-traditional. You just have to be flexible. It's a good But like this piece started off as a photograph. So a lot of my work deals with abstraction, and as far as me addressing my photography work, I've come to understand the way I abstract photographs is through cropping, just through blur, and just through digital manipulation. So in this case, this is a portrait of someone that I cropped. You can still understand that it is a face, but you don't have any identifying factors about who it is. So then this was the second iteration of the styrofoam pieces. For this, I just started resurfacing them. I wanted, almost like the plastic work from my very beginning, I wanted to make these objects wholly mine. So I started resurfacing them with drywall joint compound and polyurethane. This is about 4 to 5 months worth of resurfacing. So changing that surface so it became something else. And each of these, I treat them like canopic jars, like what Egyptians would keep their organs in. For me, they're meant to be these relics of the past that function within the present, but are also about carrying these narratives into the future. So each of these, one has a photograph of my great-grandmother, one has a photograph of my grandmother. And again, this is just a smaller version of the drawing. That's the detail. So that brings us to our current work. How am I doing on time? Am I good? Oh, okay. I will speed this up. Sorry, guys. So to the work I'm doing right now, The Sight of Lost. When I started with this work, I started looking at the Bible more as an actual literary text versus this kind of Magna Carta to live your life by. And I started looking at the character of the devil as one of the most tragic characters in all of literature. That without the devil, the crux of the Bible did not exist. Then I started looking at him as this metaphor for marginalized people. He was cast out for wanting to be the same as God. Often as marginalized people are cast out and degraded for just wanting the same rights as everybody else. And again, it's a lot of the very similar things I was talking about in the other work. Just with this series, I am moving much more into kind of a narrative philosophical understanding of things. Rather than speaking about the immigrant experience, I'm trying to connect it to a bigger philosophical narrative. What does it mean to be cast out? Connecting it to literary figures, rather than it just being about the experience of being marginalized. And then I'll just talk about this one and we'll wrap. So this piece is called Untitled Mirror. It's actually a destroyed TV. So I took a TV and I destroyed it and then spent about 6 months rebuilding it using drywall joint compound, insulation foam, and then tar. So I was really interested in the idea of how media doesn't really reflect our actual identities. Media tries to put us into these very categoric things that often many of us do not fit into. So I wanted to make a mirror that did not reflect anything back. So when I made this, after finally finding a way to seal it, which took about 12 different tries, I sealed it in this way to where you look into it and it's almost like a void. So rather than it reflecting this very limited reflection of yourself, now it's reflecting a void full of possibility. When I was making this work, I was thinking a lot about nihilism not as this kind of negative thing that we think about where you don't care, you're detached from everything, but rather nihilism as this kind of liberating thing. If we're all going to die, then why can't we just be our fuller selves? Why can't we just do what we want? Why can't we just exist as we want to? Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Häsler. This is that was a great topic. All right, let's open it up to some questions. I was really interested in the earlier work you spoke about preserving your camera roll.
Mm-hmm.
Could you speak to why that's important to you?
I think what really mattered to me was how futile it was. I think as humans we love to cling to things, whether that's an actual actual literal thing when we collect objects or when we cling to each other. I think it's one of the most human things. We all want to cling to our lives even though we understand that they're wholeheartedly ephemeral. We're all constantly dying. But I think it's such a human thing, but I wanted to use the metaphor of like those flowers to kind of capture that very human thing. Yep. So I very much like to play with my viewer. I am interested in power dynamics and how systems are built in power. Um, so oftentimes if you've never experienced my work, you wouldn't know that you can go through them. You wouldn't know that you can access it. Like I said, I have people who have refused to enter my work, and that becomes part of it. Their refusal or their understanding that the space is not for them. The second iteration of the Land of Milk and Honey, when the strings went right across the whole gallery, there was not you didn't have to lift your foot. The only thing you had to do was bow, because I made it at the height of my great grandmother. So for me, it is about designating that this is no longer your space, but you're entering my space. In the third iteration, I hung those blue casts in specific places where I wanted the viewer to stand. So when you looked up at them, then you'd be in a place where I designed for you to stand. So it's a game. Some people will play, some will not. Sometimes when they don't play, it becomes part of the work.
Kind of going off of that, so you have like this open invitation with your viewer to interact with the work, and yet when you talked about spending so much time on these sculptures and that people touch them and you kind of like, you jerk back.
Yeah.
How do you kind of gauge that interaction that the viewer wants to participate and interact with the work?
It's hard because inherently my work is not really interactive. It's more about navigating it. I often use floor pieces because they intercede into your personal space and they remind you that you have a body and now you have to navigate your body in regards to that. As far as people touching my sculptures, I'm fine with it. I kind of love the idea that that desire has pushed you to do what you're not supposed to do. Also, most of my sculptures are made to where they will survive if you touch them. So it's those power dynamics. I talk about how I love when the work vacillates between being the oppressor and the oppressed. There's times when the work is closed off and very esoteric, and it's not meant for you to understand, what lies beneath the surface. And there's other times where it's so kind of immediate that you walk away from it. So kind of playing with those different power dynamics.
After like seeing the work downstairs, I kind of got this idea that you have a pretty minimal color palette, and I was wondering if there's any significance to that.
So if you saw my earliest work, it was all white. And at that point, I refused to make anything that was not white. I would literally have a meltdown if someone asked me to make something that was not white. I thought it was just this idea of this, the absence of color, and there was no meaning to that. Later on, I came to understand it was pretty particular or interesting for a Latino man to be making purely white objects that also used pale wood. I didn't understand that it was so ingrained in me that white was the supreme, white was this perfect thing. So I started making that work, and then when I started moving on to the Land of Milk and Honey, the colors that developed were just based out of the materials I was using. The blue in those casts it's hydrocal. It's what dentists use to make molds of your mouth. It's what we had in the studio, but then I started noticing that blue everywhere. It started becoming this nostalgic blue, like the blue summer sky. So then it now carried on that meaning. And I think an important thing when you're building your iconography is through repetition. Through constant repetition, you start building that meaning. But at this point, my colors are very pastel-y, but my forms are very masculine. are very much referential to minimalism and all the kind of, I call them dudisms. Like with minimalism, it's like, well, it is what it is. It doesn't mean anything. So the kind of visual lineage of my work is rooted in that very masculine minimalism, but my color palette goes into this very queer kind of pastels, these like millennial pinks. And then most recently, that white's been replaced with this black. One, because I've been using tar, which is just naturally black, but I think it's also taking that white, which I used to put on a pedestal, and now flipping it on its reverse, and now letting black be what skins my work.
As for the abstracted language piece downstairs, is there a significance between the more distant parallel action moving towards the more near parallel action?
So for that piece, the other abstracted drawings felt like that piece was very much complete in what it was. It did what it did, and there really wasn't much more I could play with it except making it bigger, making it smaller. So for this exhibition, I wanted to play with what if I pushed it into being more of an object. So that piece is made up of layers of those abstracted drawings done over each other. Then I do tar, and then I do it over. The actual shape is just a construction directional thing when two lanes become one. So I was interested in taking.
What? Can you say that again?
So you know when you're in a construction zone and this lane is closing, so you have to. So I was interested in. So I was interested in removing that imagery, devoid of all that, and what would that image then become? When you think about it, it's like, oh yeah, I know what that is. But removed from that, this image that immediately communicates something no longer communicates that. So for me, that was one of the hard things when I started making this work, is that my earliest work was very personal. Not saying that this work isn't personal, but the earliest work I was making was very much about my experiences and trying to understand those, versus these were rooting these experiences in a political dialogue. But I don't want my work to be wholeheartedly political, because my work is not didactic. My work is not meant to tell you something, because if it were, then I feel like it would have miserably failed. I don't think minimalism or reductivity is the proper avenue to communicate these things. For me, it's wanting to strip those things and really just get to the meat of it, that it's all about this experience that, if we all think about it, we've all experienced very similar things. But it is part of it, but again, it's into that power dynamics of how much are you privy to what the work is about? How much are you not? For some people, they enter my spaces and they think it is a formal investigation or a material investigation. And then for other people, the two styrofoam pieces down there, one has a photograph of my mother and the other one has this little animal keychain that she had when she was picked up by immigration officers. So these layers, I build them in, and I like talking about them within talks, because I think nowadays we have so much access to artists through social media, through kind of video and everything, that we have we're really privileged to have that access to the way artists work. So for me, artist talks, I treat them as a performative aspect of my artist practice. It is when I get to key you into these things that are built within the work. But again, it's all about these layers. I don't want you're never going to get it all. Each person is going to get a different layer of the work. But my work is political, but it's also personal. But it's also, I'm really interested in art history and addressing, the tropes of art history and minimalism. So it's a lot of different layers, and I build it that way so each individual person can at least get something out of it.
Kind of two things. First, since you have these things embedded in your pieces that are very personal items, I'm assuming you would never sell those pieces because they have emotional content in them for you. And then
So, typically I don't sell work. I'm not a commercial artist. I have a day job and I'm A-okay with that. It facilitates my ability to make the work I want. Is it hard to navigate those things? Yes. It's hard to have a full-time job and still make art and still exhibit. But for me, that's what works best for me because it means I don't have to compromise what I make. If someone wanted to buy it, the point of me embedding it in an object means that I've gotten to a point where I can distance myself from that emotion. So sure, I could sell it. It's going to cost you a lot. And then sometimes I do go back and rip it open, but that's when I know the way I've encased it, I can do that. Oftentimes, they get encased in things that will destroy the object. So like the one that has my teddy bear in my backpack is sealed in a brick of plaster. Can't really get that.
All right. Do we have any final remarks, questions? Great. Thank you so. Oh, did we?
Really quick.
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
So for blindfolded pieces, when you were writing that, did you at all was there any technique or were you at all trying for some effect at all, or were you straight up just writing sentences?
So again, going back to language and me being a poet, they're all poems. They're all called Untitled I Wanted because they start with me writing I wanted. But in the actual act, I don't know what they say anymore. I couldn't even really guess what they say. So it becomes about just the literal action of me ramming this thing into this wall to make this one. Yes, that was a big aspect. This idea of graffitiing, this idea of coding, and how marginalized groups, they create their own languages, their codes to kind of signal to each other.
Great. All right. Thank you so much,
Thank you.